Morning and welcome back to the Human Economy Conference, Persistent Barriers, New Frontiers. This morning we are going to have a wrap-up session, a kind of review of the conference. So we have 3 members and participants in the conference who will be helping us tie together threads and speaking perhaps somewhat informally if they like. So we would like this to be as free form and flexible as people would like. So I'm going to invite our 3 rapporteurs to offer their remarks, and if they would like to even begin a conversation with each other perhaps after their remarks, we can also do that as well. So the idea is to get the conversation flowing and these currencies and ideas flowing and circuiting as much as we can in order to kind of see what sort of themes and enduring dilemmas sort of bubble up from these presentations. So I would like to invite Professor Milford Bateman to start us off with some of his observations on the conference as a whole.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to say it's been I think I have one. Yeah, it's been a pleasure to be here. It wasn't quite what I expected. When you have a meeting of practitioners, academics, policymakers, it wasn't quite, and it's worked out. I think, I've learned so much, and so I just want to thank everybody for that, because they've been very open, particularly Kevin, with their observations about what's going on and the problems and the potential. So it's been absolutely fantastic. So I just want to summarize very briefly, and going in order of the presentations, but nothing really complex. The first papers by Jonathan and colleague were talking about the financial inclusion, which I think is an overarching theme to what we've been discussing here. And there was a discussion as to that what the benefit of this. I mean, Jonathan Donner said very clearly that they pursue financial inclusion for very good reasons. They work under the assumption that it is a very positive thing. Whereas, it would have been interesting to have had some sort of evidence rather than to assume that financial inclusion is by definition a positive thing. I think we do need the evidence, and certainly in some of the stuff I talked about, if you've already done financial inclusion and it's a problematic intervention, then you need to first explain what was the cause of that, why that happened, before you then start saying, and now we're going to advance it even further. So sorry, I suppose I'm making a selfish point there, but so all I would say is on that first point, there's a lot more call for evaluating financial inclusion. We all want financial services. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Whether you can actually equate that with development, I think that is something that I think the financial inclusionistas need to come up with a little bit more evidence for that before we put the whole movement into hyperdrive with the addition of Fintech. I thought the paper by Jeremy Leach was excellent when he was talking about insurance, but for the reason that it really does show that how powerful Fintech can be in terms of addressing a social need. This is the need for insurance. Clearly you don't need loads of administrators. You just need some good technology to put the whole thing together, to instruct the potential clients how to actually access it. So the technology is actually very, very good. How you actually use that and the format it takes, I think, is still open to debate. But the fact that it actually works to address a need, I think, was more than evidenced by what he said. The next papers then went on to discuss this new term called adverse inclusion. And I think Eric's paper in particular was talking about this and how it is a problem in the area that he's looking at, that, again, going back to the financial inclusion thing, I suppose this is the movement on. This is the more critical perspective on financial inclusion that we're now beginning to talk about adverse inclusion, that we have financial circuits at the local level and the national level, but we're talking about the local level, and bringing the poor in is not necessarily being done for their benefit. I mean, if I'm let's go back to the example of the bed company, if I want to sell more beds, I want to start, and somebody says, what about including everybody in having a new bed every year? Well, I'm all for that. Absolutely, they need a new bed every year. Well, of course, then you have to challenge, well, of course you would say that, wouldn't you? Because you want to sell more beds. So it's a big jump to say, well, maybe it is, maybe you should have a new bed every year. But it's a big step to then say, to explain why you should have a new bed every year. Actually, on that, I know that my wife and I were looking for a new mattress after 15 years, and there was adverts coming out about you need to have a mattress every 5 years. And it was, of course, by the Mattress Manufacturers Association, and they said because of all these reasons and stuff, but the salesman said, no, he said 15 years is fine. It's fine. Just turn it over every year, So you've got to, anyway, that was a bit of a lesson on that. So I think this concept of adverse inclusion is now starting to percolate into academic inquiry of the issues of fintech, and so I think that's something that is going on. Kevin's contribution on that sort of touched quite a lot about the adverse inclusion aspects to it, and that you need very effective regulation. And if you don't get that, and I think we talked about the political reasons that often stand in the way of effective regulation, then default you get adverse inclusion. So it's a problem, and it does appear, at least in Kevin's analysis, to be something to do with the whole political constituency, that there are different forces there, some in favour of more regulation for different reasons, others against regulation for different reasons. So I think we need to do that. It's just arrived. So I think that was really excellent that Kevin was open about what's going on in Kenya and the problems they're having, and also some of the solutions they're trying to develop. And maybe the credit aspect now has been oversold. This is what came through in my discussions with Kevin and others, was maybe the credit aspect has been oversold, and we need to move back into the payment aspects and the remittance aspect maybe, but certainly the payment aspect, and that also touches upon the community currency aspect and the cash transfer aspect. So maybe we need to move back on to looking at how we can do that and have much less emphasis on the credit aspect. Now Chai's fintech was very interesting, because I think, like Jeremy Leach's, it shows the power of fintech to address a particular need. So I think, again, I'm certainly not a skeptic of fintech, the technology part. I think it absolutely works, and we have not just those examples, but other examples of how it does work. So that was a good example of how you can develop particular fintech applications and platforms that do address particular needs, and I think that was excellent. We then moved on to Mario's interesting perspective on this issue of randomized control trials, and I have been in touch I'm very skeptical of randomized control trials. My understanding, which is not brilliant, but they work very well in medicine. And then a group of economists said, well, if they work very well there, that you have a patient who receives the drug, you have a group of patients who don't, and anything that is seen in the patients who receive it that is great, then obviously, that seems to me a really good way to try out a medicine. Now, the problem in taking it over into the economic sphere, as these economists did, is that if I'm on the list of taking a particular drug, and then there are people who are not taking it, what happens to me never actually interferes with the people who don't take the drug. And the problem with randomized control trials in villages or between villages is that if you give the sample people end up with usually the cash, then they do have an effect on the other people who don't have the cash. And some very basic research we looked at is that the people who do get the cash and do perhaps start some businesses immediately take away the customers from the people who didn't have the cash in order to maybe get extra stock or put in a refrigerator, whatever. And so their volume, their turnover went down and their turnover went up. And so the difference was interpreted as, wow, this cash transfer must be doing great things for these guys because look at the difference between these guys and these guys. Well, of course, a lot of that difference was because these guys were taking the business of these guys. So there are spillovers that are simply not, or at least initially were not added into that. Now, what Mario talked about was this issue of things not being done right. And in the book I sent you and I sent to Sibel, by the French experts, which I think was a great book. There's some fantastic. I mean, anybody else want it? Isabel gave it me and said, please circulate it, because it is $140. I mean, she said nobody's going to buy it, so circulate it. They talk about microcredit and all sorts of other areas where there are problems with it, but they also talk in the microcredit, particularly with an RCT done in Morocco, on the ethical problems that they found there, that the RCTs were not being done in a very correct way. And this was not accidental, this was deliberate, and it was known to the people who were managing it, in other words, the academics at the top. So field officers were doing crazy things, but they were being allowed through. And the only reason that you can come up with is because what they were doing actually increased the impact statistic. So long as it increased the impact statistic, well, you turn a blind eye. And so I found that chapter to be particularly hard-hitting. They've never responded to it. Well, they did. They tried to blind them with science and tried to shut them down and everything. But it's really an interesting chapter. And if you Google, you can see some of the follow-up to that. So I take Mario's point about them not being done well, but I think he has I think care has to be taken in saying that this means automatically that the impact evaluation technique is wrong because it can be manipulated and done differently. I don't think that is a jump that I don't think I would go to. So I think it's very important to look at how these manipulations and misunderstandings took place. I think there's an article or a book, even a book there, how it works, but I don't think it actually, by definition, disqualifies an RCT. I think there are more reasons for disqualifying it, legitimate reasons to do with the actual technique, rather more than that. I loved Hannah's work on villages in South Africa, because a lot of the work I've done with the tiny amounts of funding we managed to get hold of has been in villages, recently in Brazil, before that in Colombia, in Cambodia. I did a project there, so I recognize what she's talking about in terms of the sort of strategies, but also the sense that there's an incredible dynamism in these villages and townships as people move from one thing to another to try to make a little bit extra income. The question then comes down to, okay, it's about a survivalist economy, and what's the next step that needs to be taken to move into an economy that actually starts to grow? And so that's really the question that I think Hannah's looking at that as well. What needs to be done? Going on to the cash transfers that she talks about, I mean, if you go on to the Give Directly one that Mario talked about, one of the important things there was that cash transfers represented a major injection of demand into the community, which instantly addressed poverty. Great stuff, absolutely great stuff. But because hardly anyone founded a new enterprise, then you have to say, well, they're great in terms of poverty reduction, and the Brazilian experience confirms that. But in terms of actually being the foundation for getting out, something else is needed. In the Give Directly survey, one of the things they found was this idea of overcapacity. You have people, 1.7 customers per hour. So he said, even if I get 4 customers, I can manage it. I don't need to do anything else. Otherwise, I'm just playing my transistor radio or listening, watching the TV. If I get a few more customers in, great. My turnover goes up, my profits go up, my income goes up. Great, but I don't need another person to work with me. And nobody really looking at the overcapacity would say, well, there's more money coming in, I'll establish my own micro enterprise. It's just simply not needed. So I found in Hannah's work a lot of similarity with stuff I read. I mean, people like Jan Brayman, his work in India, which was on communities, that have seen, say, better times and now are, in a sense, contracting. And he looks at all the survival strategies. So I think that's great. I really think it's in that tradition of doing that, and it's fantastic stuff. Then that takes us on to the community currencies. I think there was a great discussion about that. It's a shame I think we never had a discussion perhaps about the Brazilian model, because Brazil is the pioneer from the 1970s with Banco Palmas in the north of the country, and then setting up all these community banks across. And that's community bank is the heart of the experiment we've been looking at in Maricá. So it would be good to see whether that is working here. But I mean, it's still in its early stages, and it's and one thing that came out, I forget who I was talking to, but talking about South Africa, that there is a huge cash grant program here. Well, no, sorry, going back to the Brazilian issue, the cash grant, the Bolsa Familia, is what really underpins the community currency. Gives it so much demand in the community. And you get the cash through in digital currency, and it's a huge amount of demand, so businesses have to accept it because it's a huge chunk of local demand. And so when you've just got a tiny little bit, because it's a small NGO, that's when businesses say, it's really not worth messing about with just that little bit of money. But if it's 40% of the local demand or 50%, that's when you buy into it. So I forget who it was I was talking with about that. Might be Eric. I think, yeah. Maybe that's a way of using the cash grant in South Africa to underpin some sort of community currency program, because it is such. I didn't realize it was such a huge part of demand in the townships and the rural areas. I think it's obviously more. I think it's more than in Brazil. So if that were to come out in a digital form as a community currency, that could really start up a whole variety of experiments, which would be good. The idea of local savings groups, I think that was expressed very well, and it's these charmer. I hadn't come across them very much. Stockvels I sort of knew about, and Roscas and Saccos. I think these are interesting ways of mobilizing capital for small ticket items, perhaps not for businesses, because I think the amounts of cash. But I would just have one word of warning there, because I seem to remember there was Grameen Foundation up there. The Grameen the Grameen model no longer really uses these saver groups, because when you get big, you can't be bothered with the whole rigmarole of organising groups and people signing pledges to repay if you don't pay. When you've got 1,000 new clients a day, because these things are getting so big. I'm just done some work in Cambodia. They started out with savers groups. When you had 10, 15 new clients a day, maybe you could set up a new group for them. But now some of the big ones, they're taking on 1,000 clients a day. They can't simply be involved in that. What they've done is they take land titles. That's why I've questioned a few people about that. They take land titles. If you want a loan, you go in. It's a transaction that's done in about 10 minutes. You sign over your land title, you get a receipt, and on your mobile phone or in your bank account, your loan is waiting. For the MFI, it's fantastic because you default, then you have a good chance of losing your land title. Legally, they're not allowed to sell it. But what they do is they bring a willing buyer and you sell. I think Kevin, you mentioned that, or somebody mentioned that's something that goes on in Kenya as well. Goes on a lot in Cambodia. Something like 15% of the people who are over indebted end up going to meeting with the village chief, a buyer, the microfinance institution. You sell your land to this person, you get the money straight away, you give it to the MFI to extinguish your debt. The village chief gets $5 for overseeing this, and so that's it all gone. The MFI's happy because it's got most of its money back. You've lost your land, and that, in terms of most social anthropologists would agree, is one of the key areas where, or key factors in descending into irretrievable poverty once you lose your land. So we're looking at, it's a very negative development. So it'd be interesting if that works here. So that's interesting. That's just a word of warning to say that they're moving on to other areas. And particularly when they're introducing fintech, because in order to make fintech really efficient, you need to scale up. And so the idea of these groups is not as easy. You know, you need to have bigger groups. So you need maybe the whole village or the whole community or whatever. But the danger is going outside that and getting the whole country, because then you lose that vital local element. And I can see already some of the SACCOs that are advertising themselves. We need more people, come on, join us, you'll get your loan. They're advertising all over South Africa or Uganda. And you know, once they lose those local connections and local trust and reciprocity and cooperation, it becomes a business, and soon the management then will be separate from the clients, and it'll become a privately owned, you know, that's. The final one, this discussion about possession, was very interesting because just before we had the discussion about this, there was an article in The Nation on possession, so it came through on LinkedIn, so I actually had a read of that. It was very interesting. And again, I think this is like Jeremy Leach's and Chai's contribution, that this shows that these things, the technology actually works very well. This can be done. My only fear on that is that it is only about working capital, it is only about existing businesses, and it is only about, what was the term, mama boggers, or mainly mama boggers are involved, which is basically, going back to sort of Hannah's work and other work, it's freezing a poor economy in place. It's a trap. It's not an engine for taking it up to the next step. Now, that's not their fault, because they do what they do very well indeed, so all credit to them. But my fear is, because when you read the World Bank and the IFC, when they were talking about possession and others like it, they said all Africa needs is possession. They don't need any other banks or development banks or any other financial institutions, because possession will do everything. And I think that is not going to happen. Where are you going to get the new enterprises from? Where are you going to scale up the industrial enterprises? Those sorts of ideas will not come through with that. So it's a great standalone idea. It works very well. All congratulations to them. But if they are misinterpreted by the IFC and the World Bank, or maybe not misinterpreted, but misrepresented, and saying, right, the state doesn't need to get involved with these things called development banks, because they're doing they're going to be the ones supplying this $1 trillion SME financing gap. Leave it to these guys. That's where I have a real problem, because the real businesses with 20, 30 people that have got great ideas, that use new technology innovations, they want to export, they need long-term capital, they need patient capital. I think is the term used nowadays. They need that. They are not going to get it from possession. So that was something that I wondered about. So that's all I have to, sorry for being a little bit, I touched upon things which I'm actually very interested in, but I thought all the papers were really interesting, and I think, they threw a lot of ideas onto the table, because this is about, I suppose, fintech in the future and what's the future for Africa. So I think we've got loads of stuff on the table to sift through and think through, and maybe at the end, we come out with something, a summary document that this is where based on all the discussions, what we think might be a useful way forward for South Africa or for all of Africa. I think it would be a useful counterweight to the sort of digital utopianism that is that is rooting in institutions like the African Development Bank, the World Bank, the IFC, IMF, I think it would be a useful counterweight to say, well, just hang on a second. You know, we don't want to get it wrong a second time with brick and mortar microfinance. Let's just see how we can use this really great tool for what we want to do, which is about development and poverty reduction, and not simply because we want them to exist and work. That's not enough that they work. It's, you know, I mean, fine, it's fine for them, but it's not fine for us. We need them to go another step to do something like development. So I think we've got loads of material there. It's very good. So there you go.
Thank you, Professor Bateman. Now, we have two other speakers, and, you know, since we're a little, you know, either person can go first. I don't know who would like to go next. And feel free to make your remarks, you know, informal or to pose questions. Who would like to go next? Asha, would you like to go next? Or okay, great.
So I'll just give a general overview. I think Prof has done well by going deeply into each session. I really loved the conference. I think I love that every day had different themes and it was easy to follow through. And I was telling Cherene, I think a few days ago, that there are sessions that were asking questions, and then you get another presenter that is actually asking and then answering. So they complemented each other. So I'll just start just with things that stood out for me. There was a presentation on Tuesday, but I'll just give overviews and not mention people's name. But they were talking about digital livelihoods. And for me, the things that stood out were, there are 4.8 platform workers, and it's, that these platforms are very new to Africa, and it's something that people have started using it. But I talked to Cherene, unofficially during tea, and I was mentioning that I did a documentary on click workers or digital workers in Africa. And, you get people working 14 to 12 hours a day, and they earn, cumulatively in a month, they earn $300. And you find that these are students from university, and they have to do this kind of work because there's no job in our countries. And as much as, for me, $300, 12 hours a day or 14 hours a day is a lot for an individual. And they're competing these jobs with people all over the world. So you find you're working for Upwork and someone else in the US, you're in Kenya, and I mentioned that sometimes they pick, Kenya has been studied a lot about writing research papers for students in the US. And, so my problem with that whole gig system, and I mentioned to her, was that they don't get value for what they put in. For me, like the lady that I talked to, who was the lead in the film, she said, $300 is she has to cut between paying her school fees, paying rent. She has a daughter, and this company makes billions and billions of revenue every year. And the question is, who will be the third-party group to speak for for the African gig workers? Because in Kenya they've tried to introduce policies, like they're calling it the digital tax or something, to kind of speak for the people who, because we are not included in the whole labor system, because it's a new phenomenon in Africa. And so who will speak for them, and how do we make sure that these platforms that are really working well in Africa, how do we make sure that they're actually serving people right, and they're following local salary policies and not exploiting and also a question that also was interesting is the lady told me she didn't find the platform exploitative, because I asked her, do you think earning $300 a month is little, and you're being exploited? She said, no, this is the same thing you can get in Nairobi. You get employed in a company, they treat you the same way. They pay you very little money, and they exploit you. You know, you work from 8 to maybe 10, and you go to school, and you come back to work. You work through the weekend. So for her, she didn't, because it's kind of, she can familiarize herself with that kind of exploitation. But then still, I was asking Sharon, like, you know, does that still make us not speak about, you know, the exploitation that is happening? Do we start locally, or do we start, you know, from way up? And also, I liked something that someone says, that if you keep talking to gig workers that, you know, are using the platforms and not include the you know, the excluded ones, you know, how do we understand why they're not part of the you know, the platform workers? And I also, I've spoke to some of them in Nairobi, and they say, you know, to apply for these jobs, even in the like, you know, like, let's say Upwork, you need to upload your certificate, you need to upload your university, you know, like transcripts to show or prove that you're actually, you know, good at what you do. So that means that it actually excludes even, like, you know, people who, you could be smart, but maybe you know, you couldn't afford to go to university, but you still need the job. So also it excludes a majority of people who will actually do this job, but, you know, they're not in that platform. That was my answer to them, but yeah. Yeah, and someone mentioned that we are reducing people to data points, and you know, when we talk about people, we talk about numbers and not, yeah. And also, there was someone who talked about, you know, when we're talking about poor, they're poor to whom, and how do you measure social networks that cover them? Because for me, it's interesting always, you know, for me, I grew up in a very poor neighborhood, and I never thought of myself as poor. Even I think Trevor Noah mentioned that once, like, if you grow in a very poor community, usually you don't think of yourself as poor until you go to uni and you're actually saying, oh, you know, a 24-year-old is coming to school with a Prado, and you know, they have they have all the privileges, and you go to their homes, and you know, you get shocked that people lived like this while we lived like this. So until you actually expose yourself to the outer world, you will know. But for us, like, I think up until I was in high school, I never thought of myself as poor. So when we as researchers, you know, we say someone is poor, they're poor to whom? And, you know, how do we say someone is poor? Is it money that is the indicator of poverty, or is just, you know, other things? So that's something that was interesting to me. Yeah, and I think someone said, like, we can work with communities, but where do we get the funds to do that? Because someone yesterday, I think he's not here, the researcher from University of Cape Town. Yeah, I think also I was talking to Chai, sorry. Like some of these projects we do in the communities, I think I mentioned to you that it has been very challenging to get funds, you know, especially for the food drive that we're doing and other platforms, because there's a mistrust. Someone will look at me, they'll be like, oh, you know, you're raised in a poor background, probably you want to raise this money to upscale yourself, and it's not for the community. And so there's a lot of mistrust, and that's why, like, a lot of Kenyans who are starting, like, you know, starting initiatives, they like to partner with people from the West, which is kind of has become a very known phenomenon. So I have a project, I look for Sibel, I'm like, Sibel must, you know, get people to trust her. So that has also, like, made, like, you know, reduced creativity and innovation in our communities, because you have an idea, but you have to think, okay, I have to partner with someone, you know, like a foreigner, so that I can get the trust that I need. So also, like, for the people in the communities that I've worked in, they say, you want me to start a project, but no one is going to fund me. So, you know, the question is, who will fund them, and, you know, how do we get these organizations that will look past all your background and other things. There was a case study for Zimbabwe, and I think I sent Professor Tinashe an article we wrote comparing Zimbabwe and Kenya and leading the way for mobile money. And I'd really love maybe that comparison to continue, because I think there are things we can learn from Zimbabwe and there are things we can learn from Kenya. Also, there was someone who talked about the Ponzi schemes. I think I was talking to Sibel. In Kenya, there's a huge business. It's called M Global, a huge business of the pyramid schemes in Kenya. It's really huge. And what they do is also like they take advantage of the lack of jobs in Kenya. So you find these people, you know, they sell you an idea of if you go and get 10 rich people and you bring them and you have to, you know, get them excited about investing their money in our projects, then, you know, you will get paid 10,000, let's say 10,000 Kenyan shillings a month or 20,000. So I think the challenge is to the Zimbabweans in the room. There's a lot of comparison between Kenya and Zimbabwe that I think we can merge and kind of like extend the research papers, because everything you spoke about is in Kenya, but where do we meet and kind of, you know, discuss? Yeah. So day 3, okay, so yeah, there was a lot of talk about M-Pesa and what is Fuliza, and also my question was, Fuliza has a very, I think it was Sheila that explained this, that Fuliza has a very high interest rate, but I was also, you know, interested to know if anyone has looked into the other lending platforms in Kenya, which are very, they can bully you. So there's one called Tala. Someone took a loan and then, you know, mistakenly or, you know, probably deliberately put my name there. And they called me every day to threaten me. Like, if you don't pay this money, we are going to, you know, put you on CRD, or, you know, you will face the consequences. And they'll call you every single day. And I was asking Hilda, does Fuliza call people? No. So also, there's, as much as Fuliza like takes a big interest, there are platforms that actually, let's say, they bully you into, I don't know, like they affect your mental health or something, and they make this borrowers feel that they're not, I don't know, they are not worth of anything. So even for the people looking into the, you know, the lending platforms, I think I might be interested in seeing more examples of the lending facilities that are actually really bad at treating people. And if you delay, like, let's say 2 days, 3 days, they increase your interest really, like, you know, and it becomes really hard for people to pay it. And someone had mentioned that sometimes it's poor people that don't pay back the money, and it's usually the rich. And I think it's vice versa. That's why Fuliza is in business, and that's why all these lending platforms are in business. Because if you look at their habit, they have to, if I take 1,000 shillings, I have to pay it back immediately so that it increases and I get 2,000, it increases and I pay 3,000. So there's kind of like a behavior you can see in some of the poor communities that I've seen, that they're actually very serious about paying back these loans. And you find like one individual can have 2 or 3 loaning platforms or lending platforms in their phone. So you take from John, you pay Peter, and you pay, you know, you take from Peter and you pay John. So that's the kind, like, that's the survival mechanism some people have devised. You might think that they're paying your loan on time, but they're actually taking from another loan facility. So there's also like a huge problem of debt. Like, as much as the government is dealing with, you know, a national debt, individuals are also dealing with, you know, personal debts that they can't pay. And it's a continuous cycle of taking from one to the other. Yeah. So Chai spoke about Mchanga. I've used Mchanga a lot when I was doing the fundraiser. But I think one thing maybe I forgot to ask was about the data protection, because when someone uses Mchanga, they give their email and they give their phone numbers. So how, like, how is that data protected? because I remember after I did the fundraiser, after 6 months, I could still get the data, send everyone an email and send everyone a message saying, you know, hey, we've done a fundraiser for 6 months, but I still need money. So how is that data protected, you know, from the outside, because we've had a huge data issue with Safaricom. I go to an M-Pesa shop, I give my name and my number, and I get a text, you know, from a different company that is not related with Safaricom, saying, oh, you know, if you want to, it's kind of, you ask yourself, where does my data come from? And usually when you look at it, it's usually in M-Pesa shops. And some people are saying, you know, you write it in a book. So these books, we don't know where they go to. And that's a question maybe for, you know, for people where does all these books go to, and how is our data protected, and how sure are we that, you know, it's not sold to third parties? Because during the election period, there are people who are saying that you wake up in the morning and you find that you've been signed up in a political party. So you ask yourself, where has my information, like, you know, where did they get my information, and how did, you know, So also, like, there's a whole problem in Kenya about data protection, even though, like, there are very stringent laws. I think Hilda was saying she took a course on it, but most people don't follow it, and most people don't know about it. So also, like, that's something to look into. I think yesterday's session, I really loved the different, because, like, this is my field of work of you know, just give the poor and cash transfers. And one thing that I think I was really interested in is I think different parties were speaking about if poor people are given money, some people will be very dependent and others will not be very dependent. But I think sometimes if someone is hungry, you just give them the food, and you don't question, like, whether they are dependent or not. So even in 2020, and I think I was speaking to Sibel when she was doing her research, that most people were asking me, are you making people dependent by giving them food every day? And for me, the answer was, they're hungry and there are no jobs, and, you know, there is a lockdown in the country, and most of the, you know, the middle class and the rich in Kenya, they're not thinking up. They have their savings account, they have their credit cards, but in the slum areas, there's usually no alternative, or even in the rural areas, there's no alternative. So I was asked that question so many times, but my question was, you know, if someone tells you they're hungry, you don't question, you know, why are you hungry, and how will you know, why can't you just go and look for a job? You know, if you grow in such communities, then you understand that sometimes there's usually no alternative. Like during the 2007, 2008 elections, my dad, I think he struggled to get us food, because in the area we lived in, you couldn't walk from one location to the other to buy food. And then some of my friends who lived in, you know, Westlands and stuff, they said they could go to the supermarket and still get food. So the question, like, sometimes, you hear the stories of poor people are poor because, you know, they're lazy. But sometimes you're like, it's systematic issues. It's, you know, it's bad infrastructure. It's, you know, it's the stereotypes of, you know, poor people are lazy and they can't work, they can't be responsible. Like I mentioned, you know, it's hard to get people to fund your project if you come from some of these poor regions, because the question is, how do we trust you, even if you have upscaled and you're not still in that space of needing to have continuous money. I think that's it. And like I mentioned to Sheila yesterday about the project, is maybe, I think for others, most people would want to understand it's very challenging to do some of these projects, like community-driven, like you're giving back to the community, Like you start a project and then they get tokens and it benefits themselves, and sometimes it's not usually lucrative and people don't want to go into it. So maybe like I'd want to hear more of, like how can people bypass these challenges and how do you keep getting motivated? Because if you work with projects that don't make you money or they don't make you famous, sometimes you feel like, it will never go anywhere. And in Kenya, there's a love of, you start a project to become famous, and that's usually the goal. And I've worked with communities so many times, and also even in the communities that people want to benefit from that. So also, like I asked, how do you partner with a credible organization? Because even when we were doing the food drive, we were very careful not to partner with people who will come and give expired food, because there are people who do that. They go and get food that has expired and give poor people in a way of saying, but you want food, we'll give you food. But we were like, we can only give food. I used to say, I can only donate food that I can eat. That's usually that was my policy before, and yeah, I feel like if even in the charity industry, if you look at if I can use this laptop, then this is what we should be giving. If I'm wearing this cloth, this is what I should be giving, because charity usually is looked at. I only give less, like the remaining, whatever has remained, and not what is there. So if we change that, I think. Yeah, that would be good. Yeah, I think that's it. But I think everyone did really well in their presentations. Yeah, and that was good. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And then the mic is over.
Okay. I think we talked about just doing it all together, and then we could have our tea and then come back for discussion. Or I don't know if we were still planning to do the trip, or.
That would be like later anyway. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I mean, we have 15 minutes before tea, and or 8 minutes, but I'll try to be pretty quick. Okay. Well, thank you, Asha and Milford, for your comments. I'm just going to try to add a few here. It's been a really great week. I really appreciate again the invitation to join all of you at this conference. I'm not an Africanist, but I've learned a lot by being at this conference. I've learned a lot about the fintech sector and what's happening on this continent, and much of what's happening here is also happening in other parts of the world, and especially in the global south. And there's a lot of intersections and expansions between Africa and Southeast Asia, where I do my work. So, in fact, yesterday I was talking to Kevin, and he was telling me that he had gone to Hanoi back in 2017 because the Vietnamese government at that time was interested in increasingly digital solutions, and you were working with a lending app at that time. So it's really interesting to think about these intersections. So one of the things that we've spoken a lot about in this conference is the issue of scalability. No matter what good idea or product is developed that may have potentials for expanding financial inclusion, and no matter how much we solicit local inputs in designing them, fintech is nonetheless a challenging and expensive process that needs partnerships and clients in order to scale, whether expanding within a particular country or region or continent or eventually across continents. So I think we sometimes, especially in anthropology, forget issues of realistic scalability when we preach about the need for human-centered design processes. The most successful products, and M-Pesa has been suggested as one of them, although there are definitely some holes to poke in that myth, as we've heard. Those successful products have started by observing what people are already doing, as we were reminded on day one, which is very central to the human economy framework. What are people doing, and then how do we expand upon that? So the fact that people need to transfer value, and I say value here purposely because it gets us away from narrower debates about whether the variety of forms that value takes should be defined as money or not. When people need to transfer value across distance and facing a variety of risks, they find creative and more secure ways to do so. So using airtime as value that was informally cashed out by neighbors was a kind of predecessor to the now well-heralded system of mobile money that many papers in the conference talked about. But refreshingly, the presentations over the last 4 days went way beyond mobile money to encompass all kinds of value sending, borrowing, financing, and management systems, whether to support small businesses, women's savings groups, fundraising campaigns, microloans, cash grants, livelihoods, and more. In many cases, the vision for a system or product does not realize the goals of the financial inclusion that it hoped for, and that can be for a variety of reasons, including the algorithms, platforms, and rails that they ride on. But there is also, as we have learned, a fundamental reality that the poor or bottom of the pyramid is not always the best market for business entrepreneurs. So one area where there has been a lot of extension of services to the poor is lending, and that's something that a lot of people have talked about. But as we've seen, it doesn't always have the best of outcomes. And so here, I think it's important to remember the failures of microfinance that we've already been warned about, the potential debt traps that the poor may end up in, and financial inclusion should not be a simple reframing of development discourses about microcredit without taking into account the necessary reforms to improve that. But I want to pause and go back to something that John said in day 2 of the conference. So after a first day of earnest collegiality between the participants of this workshop, who spanned a variety of different specialist sectors in industry, development, and academia, John noticed that the gloves had started to come off in the dialogues that we're having, especially in day 2. And he asked us, what did we think? Was there a sufficient scope and interest to truly have this kind of gloves-off conversation, or were we simply too different, in his words? And being different meant not just a professional divide between academics studying money and technology and practitioners developing technological models for payments, lending, and beyond. Difference can also be found between the academic backgrounds represented. In the case of this conference, we had anthropologists, sociologists, economists, historians, communication specialists. And it can be found in the analysts of digital platforms versus entrepreneurs interested in funding and scaling them. Differences can be found in those interested in payments and lending systems for individuals versus businesses. And it can be found in those interested in providing financial inclusion for the unbanked, as opposed to middle-income customers with more predictable credit histories. So in my observation, the gloves-off scenario in day 2 had scaled back a bit by day 4. And in part, this was a recognition by many of us that our specialties and agendas are perhaps different enough that it's actually difficult to engage in detailed technical discussions and stay on topic. Every field has its own specialized vocabulary and jargon, which is always in a process of update. So staying on the same page is hard sometimes, but at least we stayed in the same room. This conference has been 5 days long, probably the longest conference I've ever attended. And we've had hour-long conversations following every session, and we continued our conversations into lunch and dinner and tea breaks. And there's no other place to go besides this campus, so we're literally together here. These conversations were very animated, and not because we were always on the same page, but because we discovered that we were learning a lot about each other and from each other, and we enjoyed the process. Being here got us out of our specialized mindsets. It allowed us to see what we think about is connected to a much bigger and much more complicated picture that we need to learn more about and take into account if we were going to make the analytical or market connections that we each want to individually achieve. So what are we all doing here on this 5th and last day of ongoing conversation? Any of us could have chosen to leave if we were bored, and certainly there's probably 1 or 2 people who have done that. But most of us have stayed. And we stayed because we want to learn, we want to share, and most importantly, we kept up a level of respect in our conversations that allowed us to keep learning. So when John asked us about whether there's a scope for this kind of work, reminds me of a growing field of analysis in my own academic discipline, that is anthropologists studying the role of experts in specialized fields to understand how that expertise is shaping a world that extends beyond them and will impact many other people. This approach is called para-ethnography by the anthropologist George Marcus, but it's been called many other things, such as lateral reason. In both cases, the studies that birthed these methodological terms involved working with bankers in order to understand better how their particular financial systems worked. By putting people in the same room who may share similar ethnographic approaches but perhaps have different analytical ends, i.e., do you want to understand your customers versus are you trying to understand local cultural repertoires around money and exchange? You may have different analytical ends, but by putting people in the same room, there's a great deal of room for co-creation and co-critique. And again, respect is essential in this kind of collaboration. And John presenting his analysis of Jeremy's Fintech company at the conference is an example of that. He presented his findings to the head of the organization that he was analyzing. So it's a different kind of anthropology than simply getting into an organization only to then critique those who open the door for you once you've left the building. So because central to these kinds of ethnographic approaches is maintaining room for collegiality, sharing, constructive criticism, and friendship, I'm reminded of another anthropologist working in this vein named Hiro Miyazaki. And I'm going to tell you about this article that I just actually taught in class last week. It was called Economies of Dreams, Hope and Global Capitalism and Its Critiques. And he's kind of really thinking about this idea of hope and how it animates people in different fields who may have very different analytical goals. So in this wonderful little research article, anthropologist Hiro Miyazaki describes a year-long research bromance with a Tokyo stock market trader named Tada. And these two literally spend hours and hours drinking whiskey in Tokyo and talking with each other about their respective worlds, but also their dreams of what those worlds could be. Miyazaki, as an anthropologist, is trying to understand how the logics of stock market trading and relations to the future are embodied by the stock market Tada, so much so that Tada creates a parallel spreadsheet similar to the one that he uses for stock trading in his profession to calculate his own personal value and personally anticipate when he can exit out of this profession and follow his other passions in life, including his dream of backpacking around the world. But Miyazaki is also inspired by Tada because Tada is always trying to create models that can anticipate human behavior that would revolutionize how stocks are traded better. This entrepreneurial spirit of trying new things is very inspiring to Miyazaki, and he realizes that in studying Tada, there's a model for him here as well. As an anthropologist, he's become tired of the same old academic critiques of neoliberalism and global capitalism, critiquing this system from the outside without really understanding what are the components of it. And Miyazaki realizes that in studying the details of the global capital system, that number one, there are allies inside that quote-unquote system that you can work with and who are themselves skeptical of the system that they work within. So, there's not this kind of, great vast conspiracy, but rather there are allies, on the inside and the outside. And number two, there's a model of behavior here that truly commits to what he calls a reorientation of knowledge. Tada, in this search for models, is trying to reinvent himself constantly, not only to make better calculation models for trading, but also to reflect on more humane ways of being capitalist, including his dreams of community currencies and fair trade businesses. So I won't summarize the article further, but I think that what we achieved in the last few days is also reorienting our knowledges through each other. It was probably frustrating at times, But once we started to listen to each other, we had opportunities to step outside of our own specialties, learn about somebody else's specialties, what are their challenges, what are their visions, and then perhaps bring some of that back to reorient our own approaches to each of our agendas. So what I liked about this conference was that almost none of the presentations was a simple, flashy business presentation suggesting that, you know, someone had the perfect answer to anything, that here, you know, download my app and all the world's problems are going to be solved. I've been to conferences that are like that. Rather, the financial inclusion model that I got at the end of this conference is that for most of us, financial inclusion means thinking about how to better extend services to as many as possible, even if your profit margin is focused on the top and middle of the pyramid. Profit can be made, but it does not have to be exploitative. All of us, I would say, seem committed to building a fairer and more inclusive human economy, one that includes all humans on the totem pole from top to bottom, and hopefully restructuring that pole so that there's a lot more in the middle and a lot less extremes on the two ends. So, you know, lots to reflect on from this conference, and I'll be curious to hear what you all thought about and what takeaways stood out for each of you. But besides what I've already mentioned, one general theme that I saw is that most people appear to be using a basket of different types of economic and financial tools, not only one. So once we realize that through our own market findings and ethnographies, we can perhaps be less missionary in our zeal to digitalize everyone, kill cash, or uptake a certain app for payment. People use a variety of fintech tools alongside cash, and also find certain platforms or alternative things like crypto or community currency, things that may also further their livelihood goals. So we need to think about these things in collaboration with each other rather than competing with each other. Another is that the informal economy is widespread and often runs on irregular cycles of income. And this is fine, and often, as we've heard, even preferred to low-wage formal sector jobs. Bringing everyone into the formal labor and financial economy is not necessarily the answer. A third theme that seemed to stand out was that the financial inclusion sector is fast changing, and that we must understand how it is linked, for better or worse, to the development of platform marketplaces. A fourth takeaway is that when we think about infrastructure, it is not only a technical one, but also a social one. Social infrastructures of communities and all the ways that they work together and help each other, whether through rotating credit associations or compassionate loans or gifts in times of hardship. These are the foundation upon which any successful technical infrastructure must be built. A fifth is that we must also think about the large underclass of undocumented migrants found in countries all around the world. They, due to their very subject position, have limited banking opportunities and services, and so they must adapt and innovate in order to survive. We don't often hear about this undocumented underclass in fintech and financial inclusion discussions, much of which assumes a subject that has an address, that has a registered SIM card, and then can on-ramp to state banking. And then finally, to return to the kind of classic anthropological theory debates that personally excite me, I appreciated how the ethnography, findings, and insights across most of the presentations show us that gifts and money are not and should not be distinct analytical categories, but are often overlapping, and in many cases even the same, which is why I propose using the term value when thinking about the things that people, poor or otherwise, prioritize in their lives. Whether this is for improving one's own or others' livelihoods, futures, ethical senses of fulfillment, and rethinking the knowledges that keep us from seeing and listening to each other, whether in our own communities or at this conference. So if anything, I would have loved to hear a bit more about regulations. I think the kind of regulatory environment is important to, as Milford said, to make sure that regulators are helping to avoid adverse financial inclusion, but also to, facilitate the kinds of technological solutions, whether or crypto or interest savings or P2P cash out. Technology can only go so far without the kind of regulations that allow it to work, and so that's, I think, an important part of the conversation as well. So those are my thoughts. Thanks, everyone, for a really great week, and I look forward to our discussion.
Welcome back to our final discussion. I'd really like to thank the rapporteurs for their excellent summaries. I think no doubt many of us have ideas and insights that we've gained while listening to our rapporteurs. So I think I'd just like to open it up and, make this, discussion as informal as we'd like it to have, and I can pass the mic around. Maybe I'll just very quickly say something and then let the mic float around. But I was thinking about Asha's remarks in relation to all of our papers. And is there something, John, that you wanted to
Yes, the excursion that you have planned.
Right, but I thought that you said, I asked you if you wanted to do that now, and you said no.
No, I didn't. I said I will do it now. Sit down. The possibility, it has been suggested that some people might like to go on an excursion. It could be either this afternoon, after we finish here, it would mean leaving on it at 2 o'clock, for example, or it could be tomorrow morning, which would mean a fairly early start, because I know several of you have an appointment at OR Tambo at, you need to leave here for OR Tambo at 4 o'clock, and you can't be late for that. So Sibel has suggested the Voortrekker Monument. And it's possible we could, subject to availability. I need to know now, the urgency is now, because obviously Kirsty would have to arrange it now. So I would need an indication from you who wants to go and which is the, we can only do it once, obviously. So can we reach a consensus about should it be this afternoon or should it be tomorrow morning? No? Today? Anybody else? Sorry? Well, this is where I need your help.
I'm okay not going.
Okay. So, you wanted to go?
No, people were talking about it, and so we were about to organize some Ubers and things for people.
Well,
so we didn't want to,
it's not a problem, but we do need to know now.
Well, I guess we can have a show of hands, and then we'll do it democratically then. How many people would like to go this afternoon? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How many people? Okay, 6, 7. And how many people would like to go tomorrow? I could also go tomorrow, but we still have 1.
It's this afternoon. Numerically, it's this afternoon. Democratically, it's this afternoon. Okay. Kirsty, did you hear that? Okay.
And if it's impossible, then we'll do a plan B, either go there or not go at all. But we'll see what you can do.
Yeah. 2 o'clock. Provisionally.
If anyone has any extra
Sorry, just raise your hands again for this afternoon, if you would, kindly, so we can actually count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7.
Maybe 8. I did raise because I stay here.
Yeah,
Why don't you come and give us your perspective as a Zimbabwean person?
So 8.
8.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Great. All right. So now it's time to open up our discussion. When listening to Asha, I was thinking about, charity and philanthropy and giving, which is something she's very involved in. And of course, one of the biggest critiques of development historically has been that when you conceive of development as charity and as philanthropy and as giving, what you're doing is creating that subordination between the giver and the recipient, between the person who bestows development and the benefactor of development, rather than truly uplifting all parts of the world. And we know, of course, from Marcel Mauss that the gift creates that subordination. So, you know, the bottom of the pyramid approach, to its credit, it was supposed to get us away from that. It was supposed to recast the recipient of development as an entrepreneur or as a customer. And, you know, regardless of what problems we might find with that, there was something interesting there in terms of trying to get development away from the idea of the gift and try to get it more towards the idea of true economic development. And as we heard from, you know, Milford's presentation and many others, I wonder if, of course, the problem is that we're not truly committed to the bottom of the pyramid. You know, the problem is that we still think of African fintech amongst the investors or the development banks. There's still that mindset of the gift there. So, for example, when an African founder goes to, you know, an investor meeting and gives a pitch, what kinds of assumptions are perhaps loaded into how people receive, you know, a pitch? Are they really thinking about giving a gift? Whereas if they listen to a founder from, I don't know, San Diego or whatever, do they now think of that as a business opportunity? It just struck me that, you know, part of it is this funny intermediate, this funny liminality, you know, between development, subordination, philanthropy and charity, and then business on the other hand. So I just thought that her remarks were very interesting. And I wanted to know too, like, you know, when you think of these college students writing papers, you know, and getting paid very little to write papers that then a lazy American college student will download and turn in and get a college degree from. I thought it was a great example of what gig work really looks like. And, you know, we don't have enough examples of what's really going on with gig work. So that was great. Okay.
Yeah, I just want to add to what you said about the gifting economy. I think it's, as Asha said, it's difficult to take poor people and now expect them to be entrepreneurs. A lot of these fintech solutions require smartphones, which means you will always be excluding a huge part of the poor. And it's actually quite unfair to say that, you know, this gifting is creating subordination, because does that person care that if they're below you, or do they care that do they want to eat, you know? And also it's this systematic issues that poor people have to get over. Like, they won't be able to even maybe do the gig work because they will never have a laptop. They might not even have proper clothes in the case of street kids in Nairobi. So if a street child has only eaten trash their whole life, like, who are you not to give the gift to them? And in which case, I think I actually want to go back to a conversation I had with Hannah and bring it to light to everybody, because I did mention that I believe that these cash transfers are a form of creating dependency. But she did actually make me realize that, you know, when a woman is depending on her boyfriend or her husband every single day, we don't call it dependency. It's a relationship. It's part of humanity. But then when we give poor people money, it's all of a sudden a bad thing, you know, especially, let's say, in the example of South Africa, where you have a welfare program, and also in the example of America, where people are big critics of this universal basic income because they're saying it's making the poor people lazy and depend on this thing. Well, in those cases, maybe it's a little bit complicated. Of course, we can't just put it into one box. But my question is, when the poorest of the poor, who can never, ever be able to, like in Asha's case was saying, in the slums of Nairobi, if somebody during COVID cannot even walk to go somewhere else because of all these constraints, in that case, it is our responsibility, and it is a human thing for the government to take the taxes of those who have and give to these people. So I think it is a necessity for us to have the gift economy for the complete bottom of the pyramid, in the sense that we just want to feed you, because we're not trying to include you in the economy, but we also don't want you to become a burden. We don't want you to die. We don't want you to become robbers. We don't want you to completely just have this suffering, because that is also a suffering of us as humanity. So I think that the gifting part is, and the cash transfers and all these other interventions, they're necessary and extremely probably important for the complete bottom of the pyramid in the case of refugees and internally displaced people. But then when we talk about financial inclusion, I think it was you who said, why are we trying to include them in these financial systems? Should we not just take care of their basic needs, and then the rest of the people can then be included in the financial system? So I'm not trying to pose a comment or answer a question. I'm just saying that I think it's unfair for us to want to include the complete bottom when they don't care about making money. They literally just care about eating and surviving.
I thought we were going around. Yes. Thank you very much, Sybil. For me, the biggest takeaway from the conference is the question of what are the big solutions required to solve for eradication of poverty. All the presentations, as Professor Bateman said, threw ideas on the table. But I think the most impactful conversation for me was with Hannah Dawson last night at dinner, where she asked, what are the big industries that are going to employ millions and millions of, African youth, particularly because a lot of the big industries or big games are already owned and already an oligopoly or monopoly state. And because of technology, a lot of human resource may not be required as it was required, say, 20, 50, 100 years ago. And so the question of financial inclusion or, digital financial services, then, what role will that play in ensuring that these opportunities exist for the million of unemployed youth? The other big insight for me was the success of cash transfers, but again, cannot work in isolation, must be working in conjunction with other variables that also empower. And so some of the ideas I heard were, free education, free healthcare, and a cash grant. And then, a permanent and regular cash grant allows a poor person to plan. So at the very least, if not for them, the next generation shall have an opportunity and be economically empowered. And then I think, just to the Zimbabweans in the room, Tinashe and Edson, just educating me, the East African, as well about the fact that the system that is perceived as politically unstable or economically unstable was actually a colonial construct that, and maybe the stories that the traditional structure that society has endured, and as a result of that doesn't have the there's something Edson said, which was the quality of life in Zimbabwe surprisingly may be better than that of most South Africans, and that of course is quite insightful. So maybe I think for me would be to encourage the Zimbabweans to tell that story a little bit more. Because it's a powerful story. Very few societies can say they've been colonized for 90 years and still endure, with that, a quality of life that is, way above an industrialized country like South Africa. In closing, I think it was a pleasure to meet you all. I hope we engage in other aspects and again at some point in life. And good luck to everyone.
Okay, mine is very briefly. As we sum up on the highlights of the conference, been able to gather different insights on I've been able to gather different insights on how the intersects between whatever the industry thinks about the issues of human economy and the academia. And I think we've been able to identify some of the challenges, and maybe probably what maybe I'd want us to think about is going forward. We were not able to identify the future models, as Prof was saying. He gave suggestions, but I think that's an area that you can continue to hone on and identify maybe possibly on the areas that can be able to influence the fintech and the human economy fusion. Yeah, thank you, and it's been a pleasure. Yeah.
Yeah, I can also maybe just say that I enjoyed the week a lot and learned a lot as well, especially it broadened my perspective on people from the private sector active in fintech a bit. I could say a lot about gift theory and the issues of gifting and dependency, but I don't know if it's of interest, I guess. And yeah, I think one thing that we've not talked about much, larger global injustices that might somehow be implicated in some of the issues that we've discussed. For example, the experimentalization that I've talked about, and like how specific areas of the global south are turned into laboratories for Western researcher and interests of capital-intensive people from the Silicon Valley, for example. So that some things also get mixed up, I guess, like about cash transfers and such like things. So yeah, I think maybe that, and then also the question, a lot of the questions about development, community development, financial inclusion and such like things. We've not talked a lot about sociality, and we touched it a bit in the context of chamas, but not otherwise. We've not talked much about it. And when you look at some areas where people are living in destitute conditions, we also have a lot of mistrust and problems of even potential social responses of the community. So I think don't know how to solve that issue, but I do believe that it's one kind of responsibility also to create a platform, or like to try to let the vast majority of people know that maybe there are also alternatives. Like I found it quite striking when I was staying in Nairobi in this high-rise settlement, and a colleague of mine from Jörg, in fact, Jörg Wigratz, Milford knows him, had organized a kind of a discussion round or something in Mathare, one of the informal settlements in Nairobi. It was entitled, "Why Does Nobody Speak About Capitalism in Kenya?" It's not there in the newspapers. It's not there anywhere. Like, it's not saying that everybody should be turned into a critique of capitalism, but we are living in capitalism, and if nobody even knows that and can't understand what are the options maybe to solve this issue. And then I think, like, when I came back from this this event and told people where I came from, then they were just telling me that, Mario, you are very naive. We are living in capitalism and there's no alternative. And that is, I think, what the majority of people are actually thinking. And a lot of people even that are trying to behave differently when we approach them. I mean, I see that time and again, you know, people behave differently depending on what they want from you, especially if you're coming from outside. It's almost impossible to get true opinions of people when you just come to an area for the first time. So I think that's an interesting kind of, like, how can we also create knowledge of alternatives, or like a critical discussion about what kind of system we are in. I think that's maybe my 2 cents.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, for me, I think it's been a productive week. I've learned a lot. made very important connections, colleagues, and engaged in very interesting and fascinating debates. And yeah, I think Sibel, you're talking about gifting and development, and I think historically, if you look at many African countries, there's always been that probably what I could call hermeneutics of suspicion when it comes to issues of gifting, and probably that explains why from many of the case studies that we listen to, people always have that suspicion with, things that are linked to the capitalist logics of doing things because of the suspicion. If you look at this idea of gifting, going back to, people like Harry Truman, expanding the so-called technology through modernity, but modernity in many African countries came with a lot of suffering. It initiated relations of extraction, which probably explains the development and underdevelopment of many spaces. So, in as much as it was all about technology transfer and trying to make lives better for many African spaces, but you'd actually see that came with colonialism, which set in motion, logics of extraction, which are in most cases manifesting in different names, maybe what many people would call old wine in new bottles. And this is exactly what we see happening with some of the innovations that we have seen emerging. And I think maybe what's interesting is how maybe fintechs and other innovations that emerge within the African continent have been embraced significantly. I think M-Pesa has been touted as a very interesting example to even the global north, although there've always been some critiques as well. So I think it speaks so much to the ways in which people in the global south think about some of these dynamics of gifting and what it means. In unstable and fragile economies such as Zimbabwe, I think we also see this kind of dynamics playing out. So I think for me that's very interesting, and it was quite fascinating for me to learn from others and share experiences. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I just want to go back to something I mentioned right at the start, which is that we are planning to produce an edited volume out of the proceedings of this workshop, conference, whatever you want to call it. And in that context, one has to bear in mind you have, in a sense, to focus on what has been said, not try and say what ought to have been said if we'd got some, you work with what you got. You can't now do another conference to fill in all the gaps. I'm not sure that all the gaps really exist as complete emptinesses. I think the Human Economy program, designed by Keith Hart and to some extent by me, is an attempt to address critically the world in which we find ourselves, whether you want to call it capitalist or not. Capitalism is a bit like neoliberalism. It's fine, but what is it? It's a nice slogan to criticize. What is it? So it's the question of, to my mind, the real question is there something? Ivan gave us a very excellent array of themes which he said had been addressed. And it is a full array. I mean, I was impressed by how many you managed to pick out. The question we would have to ask ourselves is, can we do justice to all of them? Or would we need to focus on something? One of the themes, two of the themes that have been brought up. And if that were the case, what would those one or two themes actually be? the thing that struck me, and because we're pressed for time, I can see time, you know, we've got half an hour or whatever it is, less than an hour left. The thing that struck me was the unanimity amongst the fintech people who were here. And it was captured by Kevin, in my view, when he said something which I think everybody else was hinting at. We cannot, we are, you know, if you're doing private fintech, your aim and object is to make, you have to make money because there's no other way to do it. If you're having to make money out of it, you cannot reach the people at the bottom, absolute bottom of the pyramid. I mean, nobody in my view, and Ivan may disagree because he was involved in, I don't think the money at the margins was quite saying that as powerfully as Kevin said it. I don't think Bill's book, you know, How Would You Like to Pay? I don't think Bill Maurer, in UC Irvine in California. I don't think his book, How Would You Like to Pay? I mean, it was a very powerful statement. It made one major point, which was don't replace cash. Boom. He said, you guys you're all going on. He was talking to the fintech people. You all want to replace cash with whatever, mobile, crypto, anything you like. And he said, all I'm suggesting to you is it's not particularly wise. Now that was a very powerful statement. I think Kevin's statement, but I would need to know whether other people agree with that. That's the key. Kevin's statement, I cannot reach the people at the bottom of the pyramid under the conditions which I'm working in. Is that fair? That's what you imply. In a way, it's saying this is the end of that story of financial inclusion. When we have unanimity, every person who's spoken from inside the industry or close to the industry has said the same thing. Cannot do it. Maybe you can turn it around and ask it more openly, more loosely. Who are your customers rather than who's not? And in every case, as I heard it, people were saying, well, it's the top 20%. At the top, that was your line. It's the top 20% that I can reach. Maybe, I mean, there's some things we can fill in. I would, in a sense, say to Jonathan and Shernay, please give us the paper you talked about. You talked about moving into providing people with income through platform work. But you never actually got there. You said, we can do it. We're thinking about it. We're going to do a whole lot of testing. So what are you going to do, would be my question to them. Can you be more precise? And I think I have, you know, several of you expressed a certain degree of skepticism about this. Is this really going to work? All the indications thus far is that it's a then we can talk about why people cling to this idea of reaching the bottom of the pyramid, using a new method of payment, basically. One might indeed ask Milford, your Brazilian case study of the community currency that works. That might be fabulous in such a collection, because we've got a discussion already of a community currency which doesn't work. That's the kind of that's things you can add, but there's a limit to what you can add. You can't rewrite the history of the world while you're trying to do this. So that would be but I would need some indication. I think it's there, I think I hear it, but I would need some indication from people that this really is what the central point, just bearing, is what Kevin said. I can't do this. It's all very well, we can pretend, but I can't do it. That's a powerful story to get across. One idea, one book, one idea.
Wow.
I will try and summarize because this is the first time I had the term human economy. I've never had it before. I came to this event or conference or whatever we want to call it. Can you hear me? Great. Now I was saying, this is the first time I had the term human economy. Never had it before. I came here and, I started asking myself, what is human economy? And, listening to everyone speak, at least for the sessions I was part of, I'll be very honest, I still don't understand what it means. And I've tried to dissect it from the point of the world I come in, which is fintech, and it's still, a lot of dots that are trying to be connected from the point of how do you make, or how do you, by calling the economy human, what does that really mean? Does it mean, getting to understand the people and putting them first and understanding their emotions, understanding what they need, understanding their thoughts, understanding their needs, and it becomes your problem, fully your problem and responsibility? I don't think so. It's going to be fair.
Answer, or you're going to answer yourself?
I'm not going to answer myself. You can answer, but it's a rhetorical question, but you can answer it if you have an answer, which I know you do. And the understanding that trying to solve for all those pieces, in my view, from listening to, the presentations in this particular conference, is we need to be realistic with each other because it's going to be pragmatic. And it has to be pragmatic because there's been a lot of constructive criticism, in the conversations or presentations, but then let's also talk about being pragmatic on what is possible, what is not, and what can be done under this whole discussion and debates that we've had here. So again, I'm just putting my views out there and say, I am going back home to Kenya with the understanding that there's no answers to how fintech should be done. If you're not reaching the bottom and you're just reaching the middle, then you're not reaching enough on creating enough financial inclusion. Is that really right? Or I know the customers I'm serving, and those are the customers I'm going to focus on, and that's the niche I have picked, and I want to understand it better. I want to create impact because there is an opportunity, with all the other factors and limitations put into perspective and context, and the limitations of policies, the limitations of all the other things I described yesterday of infrastructure, and many others that have come here in these conversations of those limitations, those same limitations. Do we need to ask ourselves then, if those limitations are solved, then we can actually reach the bottom of the pyramid, or it's really important to just understand where you fall, where you lie, and solve for it? So I think lastly, the only thing I'll just say is, it's very clear to me that tech, at least from what I have learned, that tech is not 100% of the equation of solving these challenges or solving for financial inclusion. And I think, from the presentations, it's very clear that if you're just saying you have a fin and a tech combined and it works really well, it's not the beginning and the end of solving these problems of financial inclusion, especially at the bottom of the pyramid. So, really digging deeper into that understanding of how do you get to solve the challenges of small businesses or consumers or financial inclusion in a way that involves that humanity collectively. So I don't have the answers to any of these questions. And Prof, do you want to answer me? Because if you do, happy to. listen to it. Great. Otherwise, I would just finish by saying, let the discussions not stop here. Normally, we come to this kind of conferences and you walk out and everything disappears and you continue with your life as usual. But I would be keen to see the outcome of this session, what comes out of it, even the paper that is going to be written, if it can be shared. But also I'll be keen to see our work and how we continue to look at the current world in our thinking. You know, I'm not saying I'm not trying to change anyone's thinking and perspectives. I'm just saying, let us also start, you know, bring that agility in embracing the comments that we've had here and the discussions in the way we are thinking about the next wave of financial inclusion. Thank you.
You already did, okay. Yeah, as everybody was speaking, I just decided to look up Paul Collier's book, which he wrote a few years ago. Yeah, The Bottom Billion. Why the poorest countries are failing and what can be done about it. And then what I did when this book came out, I read this alongside some other work, including some of his own. And the fact that Collier is at Oxford working at the African Center for the Study of African Economies. I was extremely critical of this book. And I was very critical about the notion of the bottom billion. Now, as the conference has been going on, the term the bottom of the pyramid has been central to our discussion. I'm still trying to determine what I think about that concept and whether it's fully representative of what we're talking about. I think you made a very important intervention, which I share, about how the poor that everybody has been talking about see themselves. Are they really poor? Do they think they're poor? I mean, there's no question that there are people who may be destitute, that are of very low income, but our interpretation of them or how we see them, is this how they see themselves? And if we're going to have any kinds of interventions, right, any kinds of discussions that involves them, our perception of them, how useful is it? Now, I'm going to give you just a very quick background. I started off by mentioning Collier's bottom billion. As a historian, economic historian, whatever that means, because a lot of economic historians tend to be quantitative these days. I very much use qualitative research methods. I'm still trying to get into understanding how some of these models can be used in economic history. But I've attended so many conferences, tried to read quite a lot of work, all of which tries to understand why Africa is poor. And that's that's what many of these economic historians have said is their agenda. And indeed, the question of trying to end Africa's poverty has become the agenda of many African leaders. Initially, it was a question of development. Now development has come to become intertwined with questions of how to end poverty. But having attended even the conferences in the global north, whether it's about Africa or whatever, one of the things that I realized in the groups that I'm involved in, academic groups that I'm involved in, is that a lot of the scholars are slowly discovering that they're out of touch with what they're talking about. I'll give you one example. Economists, for instance, I think this is known to everybody. After 2008, right, we asked a very simple question by, the British Queen who's just died. How did you not see the crisis coming? And that sent that entire discipline into, what's the term I'm looking for? Into a crisis. And many of those economists were also challenged by a number of students, starting at the University of Manchester. The students themselves, who are coming from various backgrounds, actually said, we don't understand what you're teaching us. This is economics, but how do we apply it in the real world? And what did this lead to? A whole movement called Rethinking Economics. And you had venture capitalists, these big investors such as George Soros opening up, what is it called? I was part of what's called the Young Scholars Initiative, but he's got this whole organization that is part of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. And I'm also part of this African Economic History Network, in which very few Africans are actually quite involved. Now, I don't want to really go off on a tangent, which I think I am, but what this FinTech conference does for me is that it brings a whole lot of these issues back home. How do we understand the economies that we as academics are studying? How do those who are operating in these economics see the challenges that they are facing and the kind of services that they are offering? And what are the real practical solutions beyond the academic, that we can proffer? So for me, what I've learned, and I've learned a lot, is that I must have an open mind when it comes to looking at economic history and the issues that affect the poor, particularly because whatever discourses that we engage in are sometimes inadequate to help us understand these things. I came into this conference very skeptical of fintechs, I have to say, but I come out of it a little more educated. However, like Professor John said, we don't want you to go and think about what you would have written, right? But still retain that perspective that you still had, and that's what I want to do. But in doing so, the opportunity that has come out is to engage with each and every one of you to see what other potentials, what other imaginations, I think, can come out of this, and it can broaden how we think about the African economy, the developments that have happened in Kenya, the developments happening in Zimbabwe, the developments happening in South Africa. How do we historicize? How do we think about this? And how do they inform the exciting future that we might all face together? Thank you.
Okay. Right, great discussion. So I just want to make 2 points. Why is Africa poor? Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the Collier book, which is pretty much debunked now. It was an awful book. It placed the blame on Africans because they were always fighting. It didn't mention really colonization. And yet this guy was the head of research at the World Bank. I mean, how is that possible? You also just mentioned about the Queen saying, why did no one knew it was coming? The main person who had no idea it was coming and actually started talking about this thing called the Great Moderation. Everything's going to be great. He was the head of the Federal Bank in the US. He had no idea it was coming, and he was the world's self-described expert on depressions. And 2 days ago, he got the Nobel Prize. I mean, how is that possible? Okay, but that's just, I don't think there's any debate about why Africa is poor. I mean, the decolonization period brought a lot of new investment and institution building, and things started picking up. Things went into reverse in the 1980s when the IMF and the World Bank said we have this new ideology called neoliberalism. We must get rid of all the institutions you built, and you're going to rely on the market for everything. And for the poor, it's very clear what they've got to do. They have to survive on their own. They should no longer look to collective welfare or social wage or whatever. So they're on their own, and of course that's where microcredit comes in. And so that's fairly, I mean, as a thumbnail sketch, that's why Africa's poor. So this idea that of Collier's that it's to do with Africans fighting and all that sort of stuff, I mean, I don't know. I also wanted, so the main point I wanted to make was in terms of what John was saying, in terms of an overall narrative for any particular publication. I came here under the understanding, and I still have it, is that FinTech, the celebration around FinTech and digital utopianism in general, is because it reaches the bottom of the pyramid. This is how it advertises itself. When the World Bank talks about FinTech going the last mile, we've got it, we've done it, Fintech, they are pumping billions into fintech because finally we have got to the bottom of the pyramid. We've reached that last mile. We've gone there. So it isn't a case of we're missing them. They're actually including them in, as we see in Kenya. It's the poorest that are in debt. In Cambodia, it's the very poorest in the rural communities that are living there, and people are knocking on their door asking them to take a new loan, to take all sorts of new financial products. We've actually reached the bottom of the pyramid. The key problem is that the impact of this is not at all positive. That's the problem. So we've reached, the fintech has made that jump. It's gone the last mile. The brick and mortar microcredit, microfinance, that whole narrative couldn't do. That's why there's so much celebration in the World Bank and the IMF, because we've finally reached the bottom of the pyramid. And I think, we have to accept that that's what the accomplishment has been made. We have to look at the consequences. And I think that, from what we've discussed, we've talked about the consequences in a perhaps very negative way from my point, very nuanced way in the others. But I think to actually advertise it as we still haven't gone there, I think that isn't quite the case. And I think that would be subject to a lot of pushback. I think we have to make the case that we've finally got there. We have the tools to get there. But oh my God, the way that we're doing it is actually already turning out to be very bad. So we need a rethink of how we operate at the bottom of the pyramid. It's not that we're not there. We're there. We're in every community. Cambodia, they're knocking on your doors to give you a mobile phone. Doing the same in Brazil, in Colombia. Everybody in the favelas has a mobile phone getting their $30 of Bolsa Fanara, but they're also being bombarded with SMSs. Take out a microcredit, take out a microcredit, take out tunes, take out this, get on YouTube. That's the issue. So I think if there's a publication out, I think the framing of it, the initial framing will have to be that, fintech has made an enormous progress. It is a fantastic sort of set of technological instruments that has finally managed to get us into the poorest communities. But oh my God, what we've done with them is perhaps not what we should be doing with them. And so we can give sort of a critique of what we've done. And then the second chapters, I would have thought, would be all these other interesting things about how we do it in a positive way. That would be my impression, my suggestion.
I don't have any more comments, but just to say that I thoroughly enjoyed the conference and our interactions, and of course the unanswered questions that Professor Bateman has already said would be good stuff to go into for me as a researcher, young researcher.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Yeah, I think throughout the week I learned a lot. I think we learned a lot from each other, which can make us at least go forward, maybe from a more informed position or something like that. Yeah, thank you. You cannot say anything after this whole round. Yeah, thank you.
Just to quickly, pick up on the theme of the book, John's summary of the financial inclusion agenda was that we can't do this, and I saw a lot of nodding heads. We can't do this, but nonetheless, we're all here, and so I think, it's more of a question of we can't do this yet. So I think something that could animate the book, if we wanted to do something like that, is to ask why we keep doing this. What incentivizes us to keep doing this kind of work when there's this recognition of the reality that it's not necessarily working, or if we have, fully reached the bottom of the pyramid, as Milford said, we haven't done it very well. So, what is it that motivates us in each of our work? Is it personal or collective ethics? Is it, structural incentives from the development community that sees entrepreneurship as the kind of new solution for development? Is it, from a corporate perspective, cultivating customer image, corporate social responsibility, and marketing that? Is it responding to regulatory requirements for redistributing wealth? Is it based on a venture capital system, based on selling kind of a future arrival point that may or may not manifest? So I think a kind of a motivating question could be, in each of our cases and in each of our subject positions vis-a-vis our professions, what does the future mean to us? How is it structured for us? And how, I think, can we engage it more precisely and intentionally rather than see it as this kind of deferral point that allows us to not really address what and define what financial inclusion is?
Yeah, I guess to echo everyone, it was very useful. I want to talk a little bit about the structure of the conference. I haven't been to one like this either before, and so from a practitioner's perspective, and I hope I'm using that term correctly, from a fintech, it was really helpful to kind of talk through all these ideas. Every single topic on every single day kind of touches a little bit on what it is that I do every day. And learning this from experts in the research area has been very important and very useful for me. I've heard about crypto. Don't really understand it, but putting it in the context of our discussions this week, it's been very helpful. So yeah, I'm glad I was invited.
Circulating it around.
Okay. I mean, I can discuss with you to go through it again with these guys. They might hit me. Of course, I agree. The point I was making, which is not incompatible with yours at all, is that the fintech people here said, I cannot do this responsibly. Right, that's I understood. We need to point, and of course we have case studies of what happens when digital lending gets out of hand. And so we know they do reach the bottom of the pyramid, but not in anything like a responsible way, in fact, a totally destructive ways. So, sorry, I should have spelled that out. That's what you were actually saying. The point, we can't pretend otherwise. Those of us who are the academics cannot pretend otherwise. We can write a book which is accessible, and I would like to do that. I mean, just something that's read by 10 academics is, we can do our best to write an accessible account of this, which is why, in a way, you have to try and have one clear argument. We do not, we are academics. It may be an accessible book, but it will still be an academic book. We do not expect the fintech people to suddenly produce academic papers of any particular description. What would, I think, be extremely important, because all of your statements were so powerful in a way, is a couple of pages from each fintech person who was present to say, this is what I do, this is why I'm doing, why I set out to do this. This is whom I thought my market, whatever you were, my clients, my customers, the people I assist, whatever, would be. This is who I thought they would be. I'm now realizing that it is the top 20%. If I were to make irresponsible predatory loans, fine, then I can go down to the bottom. Okay, but I want to know that the business I'm going to fund has a sporting chance, a fighting chance of actually being here next year. Okay, I mean, so it's that, I think that if your statement could be 3 pages long with what I do, what am I trying to, and what leads me to this conclusion, that would be fantastic. We can then write the rest around that. We've got, you can look at what happens in Brazil. You can look at Zimbabwe as a particular, and it's I absolutely agree. It is it's such an important case study of how, and Eddie's thing, that argument that this is saving Zimbabwe, mobile money is saving Zimbabwe. They wouldn't be able to exchange anything if they didn't have our mobile money. You know, so all of that is an addition. The story of, you know, if you do these stupid tests, random trials, and so on, this is what the result is. Because, and I will make the one point about this, we're saying the human economy. I mean, obviously, Keith Hart and I always understood, we always said, who could be against a human economy? It all sounds nice. But if you wanted to have any kind of analytical purchase, it picks up on the things that the reason everybody got conned, and we now see it as a con, people in your industries got conned into this whole story was that economic analysis, the analysis from economics, the discipline of what it means to be a human being, is the standard. So if you see your customers as people who need, you know, who are passive, who need to take responsibility for themselves and lift themselves out of poverty, which is the message that, I mean, that's the economist's message. And it has been for the last 50 years, approximately, or longer. But the human economy is saying, well, actually, human beings are more complicated than that idea of, here are all these poor people, they're just passive and need to pull themselves together and get moving. It's ridiculous. It's not telling you anything. So let's figure out what they do, or can do, without overestimating it. You can't romanticize the people and say, oh, yes, no, fine, they can do everything. So that's the short version.
We have about 20 minutes left for comments.
I think we will undertake to get in touch with you individually about how we see, once we've gone through everything and listened to all this hours, that's always nice. You've got to sit through the conference again, and it takes that much time. Once we've gone through all this, then we will approach each one of you with suggestions, and there's suggestions, they're not instructions. Suggestions about what you like to do. But I think I'm fairly confident that if we keep the topic fairly straightforward, if we make this fairly accessible, it could make some waves. And I think that's what, and then you're building on the strength, as you said, of bringing the fintech people and the academics together in the same room. This is quite rare, apparently, I'm told.
It is. Yeah. I just wanted to make one comment, though. The fintech's objective. So Professor Bateman has said we have reached the bottom billion. The objective was not to enslave or put people into a credit trap. I think what we need to give credit to the fintechs is we tried. Now, failing, and I'm sure Hilda will confirm this, is part of our life, right? So entrepreneurs, fintechs, sometimes we fail. And I think that's also a reality that academics need to appreciate. And yes, sometimes the consequences are negative, and that's not good, but it's also part of a reality of the human economy, I guess. Thank you.
I don't know if there's other comments. I do think there's some other benefits too that beyond the question of financial inclusion that we might want to look at over the past 20 years. In Kenya, I think there's been a benefit to statecraft and state building and institution building. If you look at credit watching bureaus and the fact that the government has tried to respond with data protection laws and other kinds of interventions, however, perhaps not perfect that response has been, I do think that that's really interesting. And I think that Kenyan people care a lot about M-Pesa. They see it almost as a kind of cultural wealth. Many people do. Shaila already talked about how if we think of building a stable coin or an international African point or a currency that could go beyond African borders, kind of like the euro, perhaps. Those kinds of institution building start somewhere. And I do think that, the story of the way governance has responded in Kenya, is really interesting to me. And I think that that's a benefit of all of this that goes beyond necessarily this whole question of inclusion, which again is kind of driven by these international companies. But if you're on the ground, as a society, I think Kenyans also have other goals and benefits that they see, from the fintech story in Kenya. So I think it's
Yeah, just to add to what you said, Sybil, actually we haven't really touched upon the amount of data that we have gathered because of digital finance. Because now I'm always very interested in statistics, and I remember about 10 years ago I was writing a paper, and it was very difficult to find precise statistics because, like in South Africa, you have the statistics boards and stuff, but in Kenya, our statistics are, and all the researchers here who are in Kenya, you understand how difficult it is to get these statistics. But now with the advent of mobile money, you can even see statistics like increases in food consumption or specific detailing of gender aggregated by area or by consumer spending. So I think that has been able to influence policy and can continue to influence policy every day. So I feel like, yes, we have really criticized a lot of fintech, but maybe I can just end by saying that it's not the worst thing because we have now had so much visibility on actually breaking down statistically what Kenyans are actually spending on.
I actually didn't want to say anything else, but given what you've just said, I was at a conference recently, the World Economic History Conference, and there were so many papers on how the euro as a currency and as an economic area, for lack of a better word, came into being. And listening to some of the papers I've listened to, perhaps fintech, despite all the criticism that we may have, has a role to play in terms of possibilities. People were talking about de-dollarization, about trying to harness the power of technology and in trying to bring forth a sort of economic independence for Africa. And I do see potential possibilities there. And if you look at the journey of the European Union and the establishment of the euro, it actually wasn't started by the states. These were private companies trying to establish their own platforms and payment systems, which then these European countries ultimately harnessed. And now you've got this whole region, imperfect as it is, but, which is managing at least to challenge dollar hegemony in some ways and looking out for the welfare of its own people. So there are infinite possibilities, but certainly the criticism is essential for us to be able to look at what it can potentially do, what it does, but also what it can potentially do.
okay. Thank you, everyone.